So I'm finishing writing on my PhD thesis soon. Like I'm literally at the end stages and it's been pretty crazy actually. And I've been just really thinking about the entire process. I've been getting tons of feedback and it feels like it's finally starting to like really take shape, which is super cool. So I thought I might as well share some of the stuff that has really helped me to write my thesis. I'm not gonna tell you that that is like the perfect recipe to writing the perfect thesis, but it is what's worked for me, I guess. So first of all, I think something that I'm really big on is structure. Like I cannot stress how important structure has been for me personally, just because writing a thesis, it's a huge task. It is so much longer and detailed than writing like a journal article or a paper, because you basically need to make visible your entire thought process, all the decisions you've made, every single thing that you've ever done to get to this point of your research. So you gotta put 4 to 5 years worth of work down on paper, print, whatever, and that's hard. So to navigate this mammoth of a task that writing a PhD thesis is, structure has been my best friend. So I recommend coming up with a very broad structure to begin with, but at the same time, you gotta accept that this will change, right? But just to have an initial structure, I think it really helps because suddenly the giant task becomes a lot more manageable. Like say you have 5 chapters, but then you break each chapter down into further sections and subsections of sections. And then you basically have all these smaller components. So every day you just make your way through these sections and it's just easier to tick those boxes, and let's be honest, ticking boxes is satisfying. So yeah, my advice is start with a broad structure, but keep in mind that this is going to change. But now if you're someone who really struggles to give structure to your thoughts or your work, then I highly recommend using AI for it. Like this is literally what AI is useful for. So Jenni AI have this feature where if you provide a really detailed prompt, for example, say you're going to do a literature review on social media algorithms and user experiences, and you click this outline button, then it gives you a bunch of creative subheadings that you can possibly use for structuring your lit review, for instance. I think Jenni AI is particularly good for this because when you also upload all your literature collection, it kind of draws from there to suggest these sort of subheadings. The main thing to remember though is that these subheadings are a starting point, and as you actually start writing, they are bound to evolve, and so does your structure. Now moving on from structure to tone. This is one of the things that I realized a few months ago when I was transitioning from writing my discussion chapter to writing my lit review. Yeah, I wrote my lit review towards the end of my PhD, and this is something that I will talk about as the next piece of advice. But anyway, so when I finished writing my discussion, I was like, okay, I'm done. It's time for me to write my lit review chapter, right? And I remember going on this walk with my supervisor and I was just reflecting on jumping from writing my discussion to my lit review. And I basically said to him, oh my God, it's so weird because one day I was all argumentative and authoritative in my writing, and now I'm having to be a lot more respectful, but still being critical. The tone I found myself using when I was writing my lit review was different to the tone I used when writing my discussion. And that's when I realized that actually when you're writing a PhD thesis, you gotta use all these different tones of academic writing across different chapters. So for instance, in your introduction, you gotta be really persuasive to convince people that what they're about to read is important. In your lit review, you still gotta be like critical, but still respectful. In your discussion, you gotta be all like authoritative. Like this is where you're making your knowledge contributions. So yeah, while what you write about in your thesis, aka the content, is important, you also got to pay attention to the form that you present it in, and you can really do that by using different kinds of tones. Now, if you're not quite sure what these tones might actually look like in the context of academic writing, again, Jenni AI is great. I recommended it to a friend of mine because she was getting comments from her supervisor about how her discussion didn't really sound like a discussion, and she used Jenni for this purpose and found it really useful. Basically, they've got this feature where you can highlight the text or paragraph and then prompt the AI to rewrite your stuff in the tone that you're after. For example, if you're writing your discussion and you want to write it in more of an argumentative tone, then you can see what that might look like using this feature. Again, don't just copy paste the output from the prompts, instead use it as inspiration to build on what you've already written. Now moving on to the thing I said earlier about writing my lit review chapter at the end of my PhD and why you might want to consider doing that as well. So first of all, while I wrote my lit review at the end of my PhD, it doesn't mean that I didn't exactly read and review literature all throughout my PhD. So doing and writing a lit review are two different things, and you gotta be reviewing literature from day one. That's non-negotiable. But But I guess when it comes to actually writing up your literature review, aka the piece of work which leads to your final argument for your research and your research questions, you can do that in your final year. In fact, it's probably worth doing that in your final year. And this is because by not focusing on the final outcome of your reviewing and reading the literature at the start of your PhD, you can instead really spend that time learning and getting to know the literature. You could consider writing an annotated bibliography instead of a lit review, because then you'll still have a record of all the literature that you've read, which will then make writing the final lit review for your thesis super simple. I think not writing your lit review at the very beginning does make your entire experience of writing up and doing a literature review a lot more process focused rather than outcome focused. And now one final thing which I think really makes the difference when you're writing a thesis is this notion of less is more. And I only realized this when I had to make a very hard decision for completely discarding an entire findings chapter. I wrote 3 findings chapters and my supervisors were basically like, the 3rd findings chapter doesn't quite fit with the broader thesis. It was obviously cool data, cool stuff, cool findings, but they felt like, and I thought so too, that it probably didn't need to be included in the thesis just because of its general fit. Now, this was shocking to me, despite feeling and knowing deep down that this chapter wasn't a great fit, because I had been under the impression that, no, a PhD thesis needs a minimum of 3 findings chapters and yada, yada, yada. They were like, says who? And I was like, that's a great point. Why do I always think that more is better? And I feel like a lot of us are metrics focused. We're just really metrified in the ways we think. So then we end up feeling like the more, the better. And when they asked me to consider not including this final findings chapter, it really made me understand this notion of less can be more.